So here we are at part 2. As I mentioned already, Sonny's Blues, just one of the greatest stories of all time, right up there with barn burning. I think the message here is even more powerful, even more helpful to us, and again, asks, like barn burning, asks some really big questions. And James Baldwin, one of the most important voices of the 20th century, a writer we should definitely all be reading. Kind of orient us here with where we're at in the class. This is like an example from the Harlem Renaissance, building on what we talked about last time with the Southern Renaissance. Here we have just an outpouring, crazy productive time period. African Americans just writing really amazing literature, works of art, music, etc. Harlem and other parts of the country at this time, hence the title, Harlem Renaissance. And moreover, orienting where we're at here, trying to show you with fiction too in our genre study sequence, kind of a second epoch or paradigm for short fiction after the Genesis, a short fiction 100 years earlier with Hawthorne and Poe. Here we have all this productivity about 100 years later from writers in the South, writers in Harlem, and mainly dealing with the aftermath of the end of slavery, racism, oppression, really the darkest, most evil, most wicked part of our country's history. And the way these writers, people like Faulkner and Baldwin, engage with that dark history shows us, I think, really productive, helpful ways to engage with the issues we're facing today, because these issues, racism, oppression, still exists. And so we can learn a lot from these stories, and I deeply appreciate how they engage with these complex, nuanced, complicated topics. And I'm really looking forward to discussing Sonny's Blues with you for a lot of reasons, including those, and mainly that it's just such a wonderful, beautiful story. But a little bit of background on Baldwin. He was born in Harlem, part of the Harlem Renaissance, but went to live in France, like many other U.S. writers during the 20th century. And a lot of those writers call themselves expatriates. He did not, for a variety of reasons. One being that he thought it was mainly white writers who had the title of expatriate. But also, expatriate implies a complete disconnect from the country of origin, in this case it being the U.S. And so I think Baldwin had a more complicated relationship with his country of origin than that, and he wanted distance from it, but he didn't want to disconnect completely like the expatriates. His most well-known work is Go Tell It on the Mountain, and that established him as one of the leading black voices of the 1950s and 1960s. You can see from the title there that he's, and probably from reading Sonny's Blues, that he's very concerned with religious, spiritual themes. And he actually studied to be a pastor, didn't follow through with it. So he disagrees with some aspects of Christianity, but his engagement with Christianity, his studies, really inform his works. And there's no question that his works are very spiritual and engaged with spiritual issues, as we can see from the title of his most famous novel and from our reading of Sonny's Blues. As I mentioned, one of the main reasons he didn't like the title of expatriate is he thought people mainly use it to describe the white writers who had left the U.S. to go live in France. And finally, he wrote on a lot of different subjects, but the most important to him, most fundamental to his writing, is African American experience, particularly, in Harlem. So there you have it. Themes are we going to study? At the heart, the center of this story is the tension and conflict in sibling and other familial relationships. So it's a story of two brothers in conflict, and it's a story of what ultimately brings them together. And it's a powerful, universally resonant story for that reason, but it goes into so much more as well. So one important kind of factor to think about here with these sibling and family relationships is the poverty, oppression that African Americans face. Another prominent 20th century African American writer, though she wrote a little later on, was Alice Walker, and she argued that she saw in families, all families, black, white, etc., tension, conflict almost universally between siblings, but thought it was even more pronounced to even greater degrees in the African American families she knew and observed. And one thing about Alice Walker, she's a great observer of human interaction. And so she makes the argument, or at least more so, I wouldn't say makes the argument, but asks the question, is the poverty, oppression, etc., that African Americans have faced, is that a factor in the greater degree of conflict and tension among African American siblings and family members? And so I think it's a great question to ask, and we can see how this story comments on it and engages with Alice Walker in that sense. Union through tragedy. I think one of my favorite parts, one of the most important parts of this story, and it comes back to our theme for the course of catharsis. Remember, catharsis and experiencing the emotions the characters experience, we can have pity in the Greek sense, which is really empathy in a modern day sense. We can feel and experience their struggles with them, which is a powerful, transformative experience for them and for us. What's really cool in this story, as much as we can relate to Sonny, as much as we can relate to the narrator, is we see this pity, this empathy, this catharsis play out actually between the narrator and Sonny, because after the narrator's daughter Grace dies, he then has an empathy for Sonny he did not have before, and it's the tragedy, the death of a child, that makes that possible. And so we'll spend a lot of time on this. Music, I love music. I listen to it as much as I can. So it's one of the reasons why I love this story. And we see the power of music and the importance of music at the end of this story. But we also see that the narrator judges Sonny and sees music as a limitation that's preventing him from his full potential, because drugs are often a part of the music scene. And so it's a complex relationship this story has with music. But one of the things I love, one of the many things I love about this story, is the way it shows the transformative potential and power of music. Finally, this story has what we call a potentially very open denouement, or ambiguous ending. So we seem to have clarity and maybe even closure, you could argue, on the brothers' relationship, and a big step forward for them at the end of the story. But we don't know what's going to happen to Sonny next. Is he going to go on and do more drugs? Where do they go from here? We don't know. And so denouement is a French word that refers to ending or closure. And if it's open, it's ambiguous, which we lean more toward here. And if it's closed, it's very unambiguous. It's very wrapped up in a bow for us. But this is kind of in between the two, because we do have some closure with their relationship, but we don't know what's going to happen next. And I think Baldwin wants us to meditate, reflect in that space. Why does he give us something very powerful, but not tell us what happens next? What is he trying to teach us with the moderately ambiguous ending of this story? So coming back to that first question, or that first thread rather, about family relationships and Alice Walker's idea that poverty and oppression can really affect them, how does the story depict that? And along those lines, this quote we're going to look at is one of my favorite quotes from the story. And it's a really powerful quote that shows why this story should be read by all kinds of people, all generations, all races, all cultures, all socioeconomic classes. Everyone should read this story for a few quotes, but especially this quote. And this quote addresses how poverty and oppression affect African American sibling and family relationships, but it also asks us to think about the narrator and his attitude towards Sonny. You know, it starts with him learning that Sonny's in jail again for drugs again. And when we see the narrator's reaction, it's so different from his reaction at the end of the story. I was sure that the first time Sonny had ever done horse, he couldn't have been much older than these boys were now. These boys now were living as we'd been living then. They were growing up with a rush, and their heads bumped abruptly against the low ceiling of their actual possibilities. They were filled with rage. All they really knew was darkness, the darkness of their lives, which was now closing in on them, and the darkness of the movies, which had blinded them to that other darkness, and in which they now vindictively dreamed at once more together than they were at any other time, and more alone. So that phrase, the low ceiling of their actual possibilities. They're boys. They have energy. They're playing. I think about my kids and how they play and the energy they have and how my boys fight with each other. Um, and so I can really relate to this passage, but I'm very blessed that, my children have had an easy life and they haven't had to face a lot of oppression. The boys in this story, like Sonny and his brother, do face oppression. And so their energy, they're playing together, bumps against the low ceiling of their actual possibilities. And they're filled with rage. Where does that energy get directed? My boys haven't faced much oppression, but they still fight with each other all the time. I feel like I'm constantly, I have two sons who are just a year and a half apart. They're 5 and 7 right now, breaking up fights between them. But in this story, in the low ceiling of the actual possibilities, there's a darkness closing around them. There's another darkness, the darkness of the movies. So desensitization of our culture, misleading media. That other darkness prevents them from fully seeing the low ceiling of their possibilities and the darkness that low ceiling covers them in. And that's why they're bumping their heads against it. But they're also bumping against each other because that energy has to be channeled somewhere. And in this scenario, it's channeled into them perhaps fighting against each other. They're more together than they were at any other time because they're in this struggle together. But because of all these circumstances I just mentioned, they're also more alone because they're not just bumping the ceiling. They're bumping each other. They're fighting with each other. They're clashing with each other. And this is the first person narration, right? So Sonny's brother sees this, but at the same time, he doesn't yet have, even though he can see this, he doesn't yet have the empathy for Sonny we might hope he would have. And this is probably his narration looking back years later. So he can eventually see that they were bumping up against each other. They were fighting with each other, and they should have been united by their common struggle. So he sees the family tension that afflicts everyone, but that perhaps is even more predominantly so in families that have faced oppression, the way Alice Walker mentions. And so we get kind of a foreshadowing here of maybe the empathy he could have for Sonny. But what we get at the beginning of the story is a narrator who doesn't even want to go see his brother when he finds out his brother's in jail again. So what changes? Well, his daughter, Grace, dies. And that completely alters the dynamics of his relationship with Sonny, or at least how he sees it. How does it change their relationship? And when she did scream, it was the worst sound, Isabel says, that she'd ever heard in all her life. And she still hears it sometimes in her dreams. Isabel will sometimes wake me up with a low, moaning, strangled sound, and I have to be quick to awaken her and hold her to me. And where Isabel is weeping against me seems a very mortal wound. I think I may have written Sonny the very day that little Grace was buried. I was sitting in the living room, in the dark, by myself, and I suddenly thought of Sonny. My trouble made his real. This story has 3 quotes that are 3 of the best quotes in all of literature. One of them I read to you on the previous slide. One of them I just read to you. One of them I'm going to read to you on the next slide. But this quote has 2, and I've put in italics because they're some of the greatest things I've ever read. Their daughter, who's a little girl, she's like 2 or 3, and I've got 5 kids, 9 and under, boys and girls, so I know it hits me. You probably hear that coming through. This is where the pity and the catharsis I've talked about all quarter really comes into play. And my wife and I lost a child, not only at 11 weeks pregnant, so significant, but nothing like what happens to the narrator and Isabel here. But I know the pain. I know my wife's pain to a degree, not to the same degree. And so just when Isabel wakes up and he's holding her, and there's a mortal wound here. Um, I know what he means. But moreover, to connect this quote to the last quote, there's energy. It needs to be channeled somewhere. Where does this go? This experience? Where does it lead the narrator? Where does the mortal wound take him? It's a trouble, to use his words. It's a pain. It's a suffering. The other line here, my trouble made his real. He didn't want to even visit Sonny. But the day his daughter was buried, he writes Sonny for the first time since Sonny's been locked back up in jail. My trouble made his real. He didn't have empathy for his brother before. He had a hardened heart. He said, he's a criminal. He's back in jail. I've tried to help him. It keeps happening. I got to take care of my family. I'm a public school teacher who doesn't make a lot of money. I've got to provide for my family. I can't go visit my brother. I'm paraphrasing. These are his thoughts. But then suddenly and unexpectedly, tragedy strikes. And what does he do? Does he become more hardened? The mortal wound softens him. He writes Sonny a letter. He understands that pain and suffering are part of life, and he understands for the first time that he can't control everything. He's been able to create and provide for a family, so he's been able to control many of the circumstances as an adult in his life by working hard. Sonny hasn't worked hard. He's been in and out of jail. But my trouble made his real. So pity, which we would call empathy, comes into play here because of catharsis. Because we're able to identify with the brother, or we're able to identify with Sonny, but because the brother is able to identify with Sonny. Why did Baldwin name the daughter who dies Little Grace? Think about what the word grace means. An unmerited gift. Someone does something nice for us even though we don't deserve it. Because you can give a gift for selfish reasons. And I don't mean selfish in an entirely negative way. You can get a mutual benefit out of giving a gift, and that's a wonderful thing. But there's something more wonderful when you give a gift and you get nothing in return. Nothing. Not one thing for yourself. That's completely unique, almost unheard of. What could it be? What could that gift be? Maybe someone dies for us. Maybe someone saves us by dying for us. Here, in the story, it doesn't benefit the narrator to write Sonny. But he knows some of Sonny's pain. Now he's able to do so. Grace dies. She doesn't choose to die, but she dies. And her death gives the narrator and Sonny a gift. And Baldwin, who grew up studying to be a pastor, chose not to follow through on it for various reasons, but did the studying for it, chooses to name the little girl who makes possible the empathetic connection between Sonny and the narrator. He chose to name her Grace. What happens, though, at the end of the story? So after this, the narrator now has empathy for Sonny. So when Sonny's out of jail, not only does he go see him, he welcomes him into his home. This is a significant change. But he still doesn't truly understand Sonny. Not fully. Not as fully as he can. So one day, Isabel takes the kids out to play. The brothers have an opportunity, a moment, where it's just the two of them on a Sunday afternoon at their house. So they crack open a beer, and out of the blue, the narrator goes and he sees, for the first time, he actually sees Sonny play his music. He has judged Sonny. He has said, Music is bad for you. It causes you to do heroin. That causes you to land in jail. Kick it. Be like me. Get a job like a school teacher and be like me. But he says all of that and blames it on the music without ever actually hearing the music. There's something miraculous about music. When you hear it, you think, how did someone create that with their fingers, their mouth? There was nothing there in its creation. All of a sudden, there's this beautiful sound coming out, and different music sounds different and is beautiful to different people in different ways, but there's no denying its beauty, the majesty of its creation, that human beings play a small part in its creation. And in Baldwin, he doesn't tell us that. He shows us that. And the narrator's never learned that. But then he learns it when he sees Sonny play. And here's the last two paragraphs of the story. It's a lot for a PowerPoint, but as I said, they make an argument for two of the greatest paragraphs in the English language, so I'm just going to read them to you, even though they're... Then they all gathered around Sonny, and Sonny played. Every now and again, one of them seemed to say, Amen. Sonny's fingers filled the air with life, his life. But that life contained so many others. And Sonny went all the way back. He really began with the spare, flat statement of the opening phrase of the song. Then he began to make it his. It was very beautiful because it wasn't hurried, and it was no longer a lament. I seemed to hear with what burning he had made it his, with what burning we had yet to make it ours. How we could cease lamenting. Freedom lurked around us, and I understood at last that he could help us to be free if we would listen, that he would never be free until we did, that there was no battle in his face now. I heard what he had gone through and would continue to go through until he came to rest on earth. He had made it his, that long line of which we knew only Mama and Daddy, and he was given it back, as everything must be given back, so that, passing through death, it can live forever. I saw my mother's face again, and felt for the first time how the stones of the road she had walked on must have bruised her feet. I saw the moonlit road where my father's brother died, and it brought something else back to me and carried me past it. I saw my little girl again, and felt Isabel's tears again, and I felt my own tears begin to rise, and I was yet aware that this was only a moment, that the world waited outside, as hungry as a tiger, and that trouble stretched above us, longer than the sky. Then it was over. Creel and Sonny let out their breath, both soaking wet and grinning. There was a lot of applause, and some of it was real. In the dark, the girl came by, and I asked her to take drinks to the bandstand. There was a long pause while they talked up there in the indigo light, and after a while I saw the girl put a scotch and milk on top of the piano for Sonny. He didn't seem to notice it, but just before they started playing again, he sipped from it and looked toward me and nodded. Then he put it back on the top of the piano. For me then, as they began to play again, it glowed and shook above my brother's head like the very cup of trembling. So much. I could spend an hour talking about this passage. And as much as I know you'd love that, I'm going to try to spend less than 5 minutes. The story is called Sonny's Blues. The blues were an important part of Harlem at this time, an important part of African American culture. The blues tell a story, and they're the blues. So they tell a story of sadness often. And Sonny is telling a story of sadness, a lament as he plays. And it encompasses people. It encompasses their parents, the long history of oppression their family has experienced. So he's singing the blues, playing the blues, Sonny's blues. But at some point, it ceases to be a lament. And the narrator is empowered. He feels as if he can be free. And if everyone in the room understands, he feels as if Sonny can be free from something too. But then it brings something else back to him. His little girl and Isabel's tears. So Sonny is singing his own pain, their family's pain, but he's also singing his brother's pain, playing his brother's pain. And there's something, dare I say, cathartic, right, about that. Is there a purgation? Emotions are coming out of the narrator, so yes. But is there a purification? Are those emotions being channeled into something better? Is he able to sympathize? The emotions he feels for the loss of his daughter are transformed. They're burnt off. They become purified because they become empathy for Sonny. They're channeled into something positive. And the empathy here for Sonny goes deeper than it's gone ever before, even when he wrote the letter to Sonny, who was in prison on the day Grace died. No, goes something further because now he understands why Sonny has to play music. He's not here denying that music can lead to drug use, that it can lead to something bad. But he's saying that no matter the cost of the music, he can't give it up because it's catharsis. It brings them together, frees them. They're able to sing their pain and let it out and be united in each other's pain. Grace dies, but in dying, she reunites Sonny and his brother. And here, as her memories come back to him as Sonny plays music, the brother understands Sonny better than he's understood him before. He didn't understand him at all at the start of the story. In the middle of the story, when Grace died, he came to understand him well enough to say, I will welcome you into my home. Here, he understands him well enough to say, I know why you need to play music. And he's never understood that before. And the road is still challenging. There's still trouble outside. There's still, a cup of trembling above his brother's head. But his brother looks at him here, and there's an understanding they didn't have before. And if that's not powerful, if that's not the point of the literature, I don't know what is. So what do we learn from this story, and where can we go with what we just talked about? Oh my gosh. On the discussion board, where do we go? So first and foremost, you could analyze the relationship between the narrator and Sonny. What is the main conflict or tension between them? How does their relationship change and evolve as the story's narrative progresses? What message, ultimately, is Baldwin trying to convey about how we interact with and relate to siblings and other members of our families? So back to that first thread about sibling or family conflict and how you can factor in there the kind of the second level of that thread of how does oppression and unique experience like African American experience, for instance, factor into this question. So, I think one thing to think about is, Sonny and the narrator have a really unique experience growing up in Harlem and the struggles they've faced. But I think there are lessons here about how we relate to other people, particularly other people in our families, and the story teaches us that, and that's one of the great things about it. And that lesson transcends a specific set of circumstances, and that's what great literature does. Great literature, on the one hand, teaches us something. We learn more about others. In this case, I'm learning about African American experience as I read this story, but great literature also transcends its specifics and teaches us lessons that are helpful to anyone. And I believe this story has lessons about both. Uniquely, lessons about African American experience, and then more generally, how do we relate to other people, especially people in our family? How can we love them? How can we get along with them? How can we power through struggles with them? This story teaches us that. What does it teach us about that? Tell me, teach me. The second thread had to do with pity or empathy, right? And going back to lesson one, but really our theme for the whole quarter of catharsis. So it's not pity the way we usually think of it, just as a reminder. It's more like empathy. And the narrator at the beginning does not have empathy or pity for Sonny, but by the end he does. What changes it? Grace's death dynamically changes their relationship by giving their narrator empathy or pity for Sonny. But how does that tragedy give him empathy or pity? And since this is the Grace question, think about, why do you think Baldwin chose to name this little girl Grace? What is the path possibly to redemption here for the narrator and Sonny? Because they've struggled. They have not, especially the narrator, has not treated his brother well. So what could be the path to redemption? Many people believe grace is, but what is grace? Tell me in your own words. And why then would Baldwin name the daughter Grace? I talked about it being an unmerited gift. And I kind of think I said my piece on it on the Grace slide, but I want to hear what you think of it. The third thread was music. I mean, this question is self-explanatory. I love the music in the story, what it tells us about music. But remember, there's that positive and that negative, right? That the older brother, the narrator, views it as this bad influence until he sees the transformative power of it in the final scene. So the final scene, those final 2 paragraphs that your professor likes so much, give you a lot to say about music, but you can use other parts of the story too. But tell me what you think the story has to say about music. Finally, that 4th thread was that open or closed denouement. So it's kind of a moderately ambiguous ending I mentioned. Why would Baldwin give us some closure but not full closure? In that space between some but not full closure, and the connection between the brothers, the way to forge a path ahead, but trouble outside, and a cup of trembling above Sonny's head as he plays the piano. In that unique space, what is Baldwin teaching us? As always, but now more than ever, I really look forward to reading your posts and reading what you have to say.